is one, and another cellular venture that we did with Nextel is another. I always used to remind him, I said, Governor, when I met you as a guy just out of high school, you said, I can't afford to pay you, but you can work here anyway. And this is the last lunch I had with him before he died. I was writing him a check to pay out a piece of our partnership on a cellular telephone venture there. But the point being is that we had, his motto, there's no wealth without production, is make something that's useful, figure out ways to aggregate value, and always pay attention there. Another set of words that have always rung in my head was I had a business school finance professor who came into the classroom not much larger than this, the first day, and wrote on the blackboard 2 rules of finance. One is don't go broke, and the other is rich is better. And the don't go broke means, just be very, very careful that you've got the cash flow to meet your obligations. A business boat floats if you've got the cash flow to meet your obligations. And the rich is better is what you do as a business person and doing the analysis and doing the networking and doing the marketing and trying to recognize value where there isn't any is you often have to pick between 2 or 3 or 4 different courses of action. And the analysis you do, basically what criteria to use, obviously use an ethical criteria, obviously be customer oriented. But in the end, the rich is better is kind of one of those criteria that will help you survive to go on to the next stage. And I can tell you, I never realized that those principles would come in so handy so many different times. The way we financed venture at Astra. Sometimes I think that we factored ourselves too much. The way that we did the Nextel deal was very interesting. Nextel, we acquired by helping out a partnership which later defaulted, so we ended up controlling the partnership of all the licenses that Nextel would need to operate in Alaska, or in Anchorage. We owned the kind of the hole in the donut, and they owned the stuff around outside, and they knew they weren't going to go business in Alaska unless they had Anchorage. So we put together a joint venture, raised $60 million to build out a new Nextel network. And if you recall, in the history of cell phones, which is about as old as everybody is in this room, Nextel's secret was push to talk. So you could take a regular cell phone call, do the texting, do the data, but also have a little walkie-talkie network set up, say, with your construction crew or your friends or whatever. Actually was a very popular feature that a lot of other people tried to emulate, but because of the way Nextel built their switches, they had a big advantage. So we raised $60 million, and we were just about to pull the trigger, take people's money, start building things. And I got a phone call from the vice president of Nextel saying, you saw the paper this morning. I did, yeah, you sold to Sprint. What's that mean to me? And he said, well, Sprint says we have to roll up all of our partnerships. I said, oh, darn, that means you're going to buy us out, right? And he says, well, yeah. And I said, darn, that means I don't get to, be at as many golf tournaments and hockey games, I guess, as president of a local cell phone company. And he said, yeah, that's fine. And I said, well, luckily, we agreed with a third party what each of our shares were worth as we were doing this other financing. He said, well, we're not going to pay you that. And I said, oh, we'll see. And about a year later, that's exactly what they did pay. But anyway, so I guess my point is this, is that I've had the pleasure and the privilege of kind of getting lucky with one core business deal, which was one of about 3 that we were trying at the time, that gave it a little bit of financial independence to go work on some others. And if you can do that, and there's lots of different ways to do that, there are more opportunities in this world than you can shake a stick at. And don't be bound by geography. You can use Alaska to your advantage. We've got great home markets for lots of different things. We are a fantastic local market in the cluster concept for aviation, for mapping, for oil and gas services, for health services, for telecommunications. Those are just 4 or 5. For logistics, where we have firms in Alaska that have used that strong local market to build global companies. And you can do the same thing. There's no question about it. So that's kind of where we've been coming from. people sometimes ask what kinds of things, how do you decide what to invest in? Because it's obviously been a fairly broad spectrum, and I can't say that I've got deep knowledge in any one of those industries I've told you about. But what I try to do is at least stay in touch with what's the cutting edge in some of the things, because there's that old phrase in business, find a need and fill it, which is certainly a very good one. But one for me that's helped, and it's helped in government too, is find the inevitables. Find the inevitables and then work to make them happen. I remember that interview I had with that venture capital company in Silicon Valley in 1982. They said, well, all right, if you had to work on any one thing, if we should be scouting out there for any one thing. I had actually carried the precursor to a PC around on this presidential campaign in 1980. And I said, there will be a market for flat screens. We got to get away from these great big clunky Osborne computers. And they said, yeah, you're probably right. We hadn't thought about that. And what would you do? And I said, well, I would go look and figure out what are the enabling technologies and who's got them. And I don't know whether it's going to be one patent or an integrator or whatever. But that was inevitable. I mean, it didn't take too much horse sense to see that in 1982, but it hadn't happened yet. The biggest flat screen you could get was this big on an HP, on the first HP clunker of a brick laptop that was there, and it was only black and white. So you could tell that one was coming. Wireless phones. I first heard about cellular phones when I was mouthing off in a business school class about where the watch business was going. And I said, well, how about Dick Tracy? Sooner or later this thing might be your phone. Might be. And another kid named, who's dead now, bless his soul, comes over to me on our way to lunch and says, I'm working with a Swedish billionaire named Jan Stenbeck who's trying to buy as many cellular licenses as he can in the world. And I went down and met Jan Stenbeck, and he said, yeah, I'll partner with you on Alaska, and that's how I got into the deal with GCI on that. So we knew that that was going to come. I had no idea how big it was going to be. In fact, I can show you several business plans for cell phone companies in the early 80s where we expected we might, just maybe, in a really, really good business venture, sell mobile phones to 15% of the population. And of course, now that one's there. But it was one of those inevitabilities, even though we were at that time carrying around bricks. Digital watermarking. Before I cast that lot into digital watermarking, and my wife was saying to me, honey, we just had 2 kids, you had a nice job, now you're kind of entrepreneuring, my mother doesn't really know what's going on, can we go to counseling? And I said, we can't afford counseling. And she said, oh, no, our insurance will cover it. So we went to counseling, and I explained what we were trying to do, and the counselor turns to my wife and says, what's wrong with that? And, and she says, well, he never explained it to me that way before. But we did kind of, we had sold our house, and we took the money, and we put it into this brand new venture. And it was, you talk about where does angel capital come from? It comes from, what is it, Alan? 4Fs, friends, family, fools. I was the fool. But the point being is we put it in there and had a yard sale to pay the mortgage one month. Okay? The point being is it is tough. But digital watermarking, I had heard Nicholas Negroponte, who wrote a book called Being Digital at the beginning of the dot-com boom, a book I'd still recommend to you, on the radio, saying, and we're going to need digital watermarking. And I called him up, or actually sent him an email. First time I ever used the internet. Believe it or not, we went and found his email address at MIT. I sent him an email saying, we've got this digital watermarking technology. What do you think of it? Dr. John Gerster, for any of you who knew him, we did the email from his office. I had never used the internet before. This is 1994. And Negroponte writes back, it's definitely needed. There is no market leader. You guys could be it. And we ended up being it. But it was one of those inevitabilities because you were putting so much content into something that could be instantly replicated a billion times. Google Maps and Street View. I told you that the success story of Street View, and Google itself was hedging its bets. It gave us a lot of money, but it also worked with 3 or 4 other ventures we didn't know about. The market didn't know about either, and so the market took our price way up. And then when it became evident that Google was working with several. But before that, before we even got into the camera thing, the earliest investment we did at Venture at Astra was $90,000 into somebody who had this idea that was almost identical to what Google Maps was. And we knew that that was inevitable. And I'd known Walter Scott because he'd come up here to Alaska asking for money when we started the Kodiak launch site, who invented, or who started Digital Globe that kind of made spy satellite type pictures available to anybody in the world. And they made Google Maps work, and we talked about adding on all the mashups and so forth. And someplace in a bunch of files in my garage, I can show you what was going to be that company. Well, somebody else had the same idea and made that happen, but it was an inevitability that makes it happen. So again, whether it's big or small, and small can be ice cream at a busy beach. Big can be taking something that may ultimately happen. Spy satellite data that was only available to people in the Situation Room of the White House being available to everybody. That's an inevitability ultimately. And how do you ride that kite? And that's the criteria that I've looked at. Another criteria is to, in that case, is find marketing channels, try to own them. And for me, that's always been try to figure out who is your strategic partner going to be. Wally Hickel once said, after he lost his first wife, he said, "I know my next bride is going to be a Struts girl." He's told that story a million times. I feel like I'm comfortable telling it to you. And he married Hermann. But the point is this, is that we sat down and we said, okay, if this business works at Digimarc, who will our partners be? Polaroid was on the wall. The banknote guys were on the wall. Macrovision was on the wall. Okay, it took us several years to convince them to make a deal with us, but we knew it was inevitable that they would be those strategic partners. And if you take a look at something in common of several of the ventures that I've done, it's almost always, we've got the strong local market or the strong local knowledge or the strong unique backwater knowledge of one tool that a big company will need, and the big companies will give you a lift. So understand who your strategic partners are going to be. Governor Hickel always liked to say, pioneers never make money, but they show you that something's possible. And one of the very important challenges for a startup business, for a new venture, is trying to figure out how you not only convince people that something's possible, but also do the sustainable. And I will tell you, that was the challenge, the biggest place where I think we had that challenge was in immersive media. Spherical cameras exist now. We made them exist. We made them work viably. There's lots of other further tech improvements that will happen in that business. But we showed it's a viable business. We didn't necessarily show it was a viable business for us over the long term. Okay? And that particular challenge is a constant one. So anyway, those are some of the entrepreneurial questions, and I'll just say that as an Alaskan and now serving in state office, one of the things that we try to do is, the governor and I know both come to this job as basically being free marketeers. We also come to this job as knowing that the state owns considerable assets and that the federal government owns considerable assets, and that we all own or have in common considerable assets like our strategic location. And so part of our job in state government is to do what we can to enable businesses, whether it's startups or others, keep things going. Obviously, keeping the pipeline full is a major priority. It provides 90% of the state budget. It is a huge employer in the state. Obviously, keeping a healthy fishing industry, a healthy tourism industry, the other two supersized employers, is very big. Obviously, keeping the military here strong is very big. But in terms of business development and getting to a place where we have a broader tax base and so forth, don't be afraid of high-tech opportunities. I met with some tech entrepreneurs yesterday where, sometimes just even the good offices of the lieutenant governor writing a letter to an outside company to make an introduction. I chair something called the Aerospace States Association. I didn't realize this. 47,000 Alaskans, or 10% of our workforce, either fly airplanes, fix them, fill them, launch rockets out of Kodiak. We're a very aviation-oriented state. We've got some pretty impressive clusters here. So I chair the Aerospace States Association. We're actually partnered up with Florida was the White House about 3 weeks ago now, trying to convince them that if you're going to do faster, cheaper, better launch, take a look at the state subsidized launch sites, Florida, Alaska, Virginia, New Mexico, because we can help you save money. Had a conversation with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who knows Alaska very well, when he was here last weekend. And so in state government, it's helping build on our strategic capabilities and helping build the tools for small business. What happens here at the University of Christie, that was a very nice reception the other day for the Minority Business Center, NABEC, which I think I've got. We have expanded the capability of ADA. I'm happy to see what Alan is doing with the municipality, and it was something that Alan had advocated us to look at the state. We got the governor to sign off on going for it, and then we realized we didn't have the legislative authority to do everything that we needed to do, so we tossed the ball to the municipality, which does. And so Alan's working on that and trying to build new venture capital funding here. I co-chair the State Committee on Research, where one of the things we're doing is we're looking at what are the key drivers in the state's economy and what are the game changers in the next 10 years that we can see, or at least foresee, that maybe we do a little bit more investment in our university or help get the facilities if it's, if for example, the mariculture people in Southeast Alaska are right, and by the way, I was in China this fall and ate lots of Alaskan sea cucumber served at fancy banquets. We are going to be exporting several $100 million worth of shellfish and other kinds of fish that you can, or other kinds of shellfish that you can do in mariculture. So I pushed for a couple of $1 million to kind of get the hatchery and that effort started down in Ketchikan, and fixing the hatchery in Seward and so forth, because that's something that the state can do that's almost like brood stock. You can put lots of different people into business. And there are other things like that that we're paying attention to. We've been paying attention to Kodiak, and you saw the governor went from a very small kind of maintenance investment in Kodiak to $8 million and maybe more coming down the pike, because there's a very good chance that on the mid-size launch vehicles that that the world is now recognizing, in the United States, the Air Force and NASA and other agencies are recognizing the best place to put something into a polar orbit in the United States of America is right from Kodiak, Alaska. And then there are lots of other things. We've got an investment tax credit pending in the legislature. There's some other legislation I think Alan has probably talked about pending in the legislature. And there's things that we can do there too. So anyway, I leave you today as somebody who, one, is very enthusiastic about the opportunities this world has to offer. Very enthusiastic about the fact that Alaskans are in the world and of the world. There are things that we can do, and there are things that we're doing already that impact global markets. We met with the Premier of China, and he talks about the scoreboard of how much do they sell us versus how much do we sell them. And I said, yeah, we'll work on adding the scoreboard, and have we got a deal for you, $7 billion a year worth of natural gas. But you should realize we already joined at the hip on transportation infrastructure. We could be joined further at the hip on shipping, moving from aviation to also shipping infrastructure. You talk about inevitability. If it is a 40% savings, and if the Arctic Ocean is becoming accessible, one of the things I've been pushing for us to think is inevitably what's going to happen with Arctic shipping. Marine safety is first, but there are services, improvements to life in Western Alaska that we can get out of that. So we're working on that. So anyway, I'm going to shut up and open up for questions, but just tell you, Godspeed in your work. Alaska is a wonderful place, and there's a lot of opportunity. And it is a community that is stronger than you think, and there are people like our CEO, our Chief Encouragement Officer, who will help you find what you're looking for. And our office is open to you too. The work at the university that Christie and others do is very important. Scott and the efforts here at APU and recognize that. We happen to have, I was on the phone the other day with the Lieutenant Governor of Colorado to get him involved in the Aerospace States Association, and he said, well, I am already head of the Colorado Space Alliance, and we got 300 members. And I said, well, I guess you could say you got me, except that I'll bet you that at least 10% of those companies, at least 30 of those are Alaskan-owned companies. And he said, well, you got me. I think it's probably more. And the fact is that because of our native corporations, because of the 8A program, there is a huge global network right here in Anchorage that you can leverage. We're looking at ways to leverage our permanent fund. We're looking at ways, the fund board was talking about that this week. And this is a great place, in my mind, to start a business and to think global. Anyway, thank you very much. Sir.
I have a question. So obviously you're more emphasis on like the oil and gas industry in Alaska, but where do you see the agriculture industry going?
Lots of different places when you see agriculture, it requires some kind of a subsidy. On the other hand, there are also some crops that don't. We've gone through a couple of subsidy periods in Alaska history. We subsidized clearing a lot of land. We subsidized a dairy for some time. We built infrastructure that is often cited in legislative debate there. I think there are things that can grow here that make some sense. We do subsidize right now a laboratory for virus-free seed potatoes and so forth. I will just tell you something. Robert L. Anderson, who was a great entrepreneur, who was head of ARCO when it discovered Prudhoe Bay, was later on our board at Yukon Pacific, and a very neat guy to know. And he predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union. This is way off patch on agriculture, but he said it's because economically it doesn't work. No matter how big the government is, economically it doesn't work. So I guess my advice to you is that if you see opportunities in agriculture, and maybe there's some subsidy or other, just make sure the fundamental economics work. Because there are, we've got the cold, which is an advantage. We've got the long summer growing season, which is an advantage. We've got lots of cheap land, which is an advantage. So at any rate, I think there are opportunities. The potato story is one that I've heard is big. There's a sugar beet story that I hear often, which has got big potential. I'd love to see it happen.
Thank you.
Sir.
I was going to say, what do you know about the vertical farms, and if there's any thing going on with that statewide?
You mean kind of hydroponics?
Well, it doesn't have to be, just going up, because you're talking about clearing land.
Right.
If you go up, you don't need to clear land.
Well, there are a couple of guys that are trying. I haven't seen them go. Well, actually, they kind of are vertical. Have you been to Chena Hot Springs?
Yeah.
Okay, and you saw how Bernie Carl has got, tomato vines that are 10 feet high and doing all that, and he's actually looking at putting in a major greenhouse now, using the waste heat from a garbage to power incineration plant to do a greenhouse to actually do a lot. And you may have heard our governor talk about food security more than most governors talk about, and certainly more than most conservative governors talk about. We are interested in making sure that Alaska, can't be cut off from its food supply, and that we've got better indigenous food supply here, and that involves a lot of things, including intensive moose management and supporting that kind of agriculture. So, yeah.
What's the next opportunity for telecommunications as far as a competition, or does GCI, for example, kind of have a monopoly hang on here in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, as someone who knew the guys at GCI since it was a folding table, I can actually, my grandmother was proud of the fact that she had a cousin named Theodore Vail who kind of helped create ATT nationally. And as somebody who knows the management now of not only our big three, but a lot of our smaller telecom companies around the state, I'm going to argue that, we were first in bringing satellite telephony to rural Alaska. We were a major local market for that. The head of Scientific Atlanta, in a speech in Anchorage in the 80s, said if it hadn't been for the Alaska market, his company that made big satellite dishes